Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to the show regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. It's been a while. And then John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer, journalist extraordinaire, who is based in Montpelier right now, which is going to be very important for the conversation we're having around the flooding of 2023 or July. It might just be the July 2023 flooding at this point. We don't know what the rest of the year holds for us. But I want to welcome John. Thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, I think the forecast for tomorrow includes locusts.
Sure feels that way, doesn't it?
Well,
It feels every time I open my weather app, it's like, bad air, bad rain, bad thunderstorms, bad something.
Flood warning. Yeah, at one point there were 4 active advisories on my weather app.
Oh, wow. Well,
yeah.
I'm glad we're here today because, as I said to you, both of you before the show, I was talking with Kevin O'Connor yesterday, and the flooding has reached an interesting point that I think for a lot of journalists, when you're covering an ongoing crisis, there's the event, but then there's the recovery. And I think a lot of people start tuning out during the recovery. They're like, well, this isn't very exciting. However, in my mind, what we do now and how we recover is greatly going to impact how we fare in the next crisis, whether it's flooding or something else. And so in many ways, this recovery time, although boring and bureaucratic and confusing and all those things, is so crucially important. And I would love, John, if you would just share your experience right now being in Montpelier, because downtown Montpelier really did get hit pretty hard this round of flooding.
Yeah, the city of Montpelier was flooded completely, and as I semi-jokingly said on my blog, this is the 3rd 100-year event we've had in the last 30 years. The flood of 1992, Irene in 2011, and now this. And I have heard from downtown merchants who say, I could rebuild my business, but why should I if this is just going to happen again? And you got that towns and cities all over Vermont are built in floodplains. Back in the 19th century, the water power drove the industry, and you built the city around that, and that's where the transportation corridors were along the rivers. That's where we built our roads and railroads. That's where most of the working class housing is, in the low-lying areas. Yeah. And we still, apparently the state still doesn't have a handle on how many people are currently unhoused because of last week's flooding. And how much worse our affordable housing crisis just got. It's a huge mess. And I will, just in case I get interrupted during this podcast, we live on a hill outside Montpelier, and so we did not get flooded, but the rain came down so heavily that it kind of backed up into our ground floor. And we are still dealing with that. Those watching on Facebook will see that my office is what we call in the business higgledy-piggledy. We are dealing with minor, very, very minor issues compared to what other people are going through. So it's possible I'll get interrupted during this podcast.
For an insurance adjuster?
We shall buy an insurance adjuster. And in fact, I'm going to step out just for a second right now, because I need to deal with something and I'll be right back. So I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, John. And this is a really good opportunity to say, for folks who might not feel that they were very impacted, maybe you had a rug destroyed in your basement, maybe you needed to buy some fans. Even folks experiencing that level of impacts from these storms should call 211 and report those damages, because that is actually how we leverage federal funds. So it's not that, it's okay if you don't feel like you need the help. It's okay if it feels like it's, just a little bit and you've taken care of it. Anyone impacted by the storm with even a small amount of property damage should please report to 211. Because again, that's how we access federal money for your neighbors who might really need it more than you do. And if you've had big impacts, also please report to 211. But imagine that those folks might be more engaged. So I appreciate that John led with sort of how we've been building our communities up until now, because it's been really interesting to be in Brattleboro for this storm, because we've done a lot of flood mitigation work post Irene,
Yes.
pre this storm. And while we don't have sort of final reports back from the engineers who worked on that project, they've been monitoring they were there, the first day of the storm, and they've been monitoring very closely. So we're going to get a full report shortly. But Brattleboro experienced really no flood damage at all. There were some cases where the water was just coming down so high and people's lawns were shaped in such a way that they wound up with taking in water. But the flood zones that we set up, the flood plains that we set up post Irene made all the difference. And our mobile home park in my district, Mountain Home, which was devastated in the last storm, has done a huge amount of master planning work. And while there were a few homes at the base of the hill that did have water flow through them, they actually didn't have any structural damage. And those are the homes that have in fact been asked to relocate to different places in the park. They are trying to turn that whole area into a floodplain. So, and in speaking with our Congresswoman Becca Ballant about her statewide tour, she said there are a number of communities that she's seen, that she's heard similar stories about, that have done that flood mitigation work that made the difference. And I don't say that to crow about how amazing it is to be down here in Brattleboro. There's actually, it's more to say that in those cases, one, it's still the most vulnerable who are impacted. So, here in Brattleboro, it was the newest, youngest farmers in the worst possible farmland who had their crops wiped out. And folks who were didn't have permanent housing, who have been living in tent encampments, often down by the river or by the railroad tracks, had their settlements wiped out and their possessions washed away. So, once again, most vulnerable, most marginalized, impacted the most by these storms. And there are things that we can do and should be doing in this recovery to make sure that we are building better next time. I was on a call with the administration earlier today, and about halfway through, they kept on saying, well, we actually learned something during COVID to apply to this, and we learned something during Irene to apply to this. And I was like, oh, we are getting better at emergencies because we have so many of them.
We've had practice.
Yay. So that's sort of an interesting piece of all this. I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of all the different places I think we're going to need to be focusing resources in, all the different places across state government that we see impacts, but I can wait on that, Olga, if we want to jump back to John, or if that's a good place to go.
I do want to jump back to John, but before we do, I'm just curious, can you share what folks learned from COVID that they could apply to this? Because I think sometimes when we think of recovery and we think of crises, we put them in very definite buckets of a pandemic behaves like this, a flood behaves like that, and we don't always cross over. So if you can share that, I'm just out of curiosity.
Yeah, a few quick little ones. So most of state government is much more able to relocate and respond quickly than they were before. So, most of, a huge amount of state government is in downtown Montpelier. they are all able to work remotely and function as teams remotely in a way that they certainly were not capable of before. So that's a huge difference. So they can be, they've also moved very far away from paper records because of the pandemic, because they were working remotely. And so a lot fewer records were destroyed than were destroyed during Irene flooding. So that's sort of one piece of workflow. Another is, a quick business shutdown and our understanding of what that might do to both the economy and what businesses might need short term, and how to be both like flexible and accountable in that case. I think the administration, I hope, has learned something in that case. We know how, giving money directly to individuals in times of stress can come back to strengthen our economy and people's lives overall. That's a lesson learned that we keep on coming back to, and that's true in this crisis just as much as that crisis. One way this is different that I thought was really interesting, though, is that during the pandemic, people were locked inside and like really were listening to all information coming to them, sometimes to our own detriments, because we were all locked here and, locked inside together. And in this, so it was very easy to get information to Vermonters. In this crisis, people are outside shoveling, building, talking to neighbors. And so getting public information out in the case of what seems to me to be an information overload is much more challenging. So that's just like a few quick little lessons learned in both directions.
Thank you, Emily. That's definitely feeds my curiosity and my nosiness, so I appreciate it. John, you were mentioning business owners, and Emily just brought up business owners. For folks who may not be familiar with a lot of New England downtowns, we tend to have buildings that have, in the main business district, will have retail or some kind of commercial on the first floor, and then the upper floors tend to be offices and or apartments. And so with the flooding on the first floor, of course, I suspect a lot of businesses were hit in Montpelier. Have you had a chance to talk to business owners, and what are you hearing from them?
Well, it's a real mix. I mean, there's a huge amount of community support. There's a huge amount of, response and help that's very heartening. The dedication of a lot of the merchants is also very encouraging and kind of heartwarming. At the same time, they're dealing with massive losses and uncertain recovery, and their businesses are in a floodplain that's been flooded frequently. So some of them are determined to build back. Some of them are doubtful. Some of them are questioning whether it's even a smart thing to do. Downtown Montpelier may take a very large and long-lasting hit from all of this. And, Montpelier is one of our more prosperous downtowns. So that's not a, in the big picture, that's not a huge issue. But, right down the road in Barrie, they've been trying to rebuild their downtown for years and years. And they got hit at least as hard as Montpelier did. And have gotten a lot less attention, frankly, because Montpelier is the capital city.
Mm-hmm.
And, there have been questions raised about whether Barrie is, whether Montpelier is getting more than its share of the assistance, which is kind of an unfair thing to say because everybody could use all the help they're getting. But at the same time, there are people in Barrie who are wondering when it's going to be their turn. There was an absolutely devastating article, which I highly recommend, by Colin Flanders of 7 Days, about a mobile home park in Berlin that was completely wiped out. And, those people are like, they're wondering what's going to happen to them. They have no confidence whatsoever that they're going to be helped out. One of them said, if I got the quote right, nobody gives a F about a trailer park. Emily's story makes me think that maybe that's not quite so true, but those people are in a world of hurt and they don't know where the help is going to come from. They had a guy, and Colin wrote about this, they had a guy come through who was offering to buy their damaged mobile homes for cheap. Give them a few $1,000s and take their home away from them, and they don't have to worry about disposal and all of that, which sounds like a deal, but it might interfere with them getting FEMA assistance.
Hmm.
So the vultures are circling, and people are short of long on questions and short on answers, and that's true across the board, I think.
Hmm. Well, thank you, John. I think that brings us to what Emily had mentioned just a couple minutes ago about state resources and where we deploy them.
Mhm.
What have you been hearing around that, Emily?
So I don't want to call an emergency interesting, but we really have very varied impacts. So we have 4 downtowns that were deeply hit, right? Montpelier, Barrie, Ludlow, and Londonderry. Barrie and Montpelier are quite different from Ludlow and Londonderry in terms of not all that many people live in Ludlow and Londonderry, right? They have very vibrant downtowns, but those are vibrant downtowns that are supported by one large corporation and might have a lot more resources available to rebuild. Barrie and Montpelier are very sort of nonprofit, government heavy, with a lot of huge number of apartments on upper floors above businesses. So those are, again, 2 very different. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Emily, just for clarity, when you talk about Ludlow and Londonderry and you say one large corporation, they tend to be, are you talking about that they tend to be ski towns
They're
and
ski
tourist
towns, yeah.
towns? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Just wanted that clarity for
thank
folks
you.
who aren't in the area.
So, those are ski towns, same ski mountains, very, and again, not very many people live there. Barrie and Montpelier, a huge number of people live there, huge number of sort of nonprofit central to their, government central to their, attention there. Certainly, Montpelier has a lot more people with the time and the flexibility with their work lives to volunteer than folks in Barrie necessarily do. The Barrie Montpelier class divide has always been sort of a fascinating and difficult dynamic between those 2 towns. And so we have that. And then there are a lot of areas of the state, a lot of the Northeast Kingdom had really significant road damage, but very little business damage and not all that much home damage. So that's sort of like another interesting part of this. So the mobile homes that were parks that were destroyed are mostly privately owned mobile home parks, not cooperative mobile home parks, which is another difference from Irene. Which changes sort of funding context. And so those are sort of like some interesting pieces of the puzzle. When we think about what recovery looks like, is it my computer that's beeping or is it someone else's?
I think it's yours. I'm not hearing anything.
Okay. When we think about recovery or even just figuring this all out, what we see is a few different areas. So there's businesses who might need some space in order to just sort of make it through to the other side of this, right? Like they want to retain employees. Those individuals need to be retained with their salaries. How does that all look, right? There is, what does money like that look? There's unemployment insurance assistance, which is, there's a special federal unemployment insurance assistance that is available for independent contractors, as well as sort of standard unemployment insurance. But again, we all know that unemployment insurance is less money than a salary. We've talked about that fairly extensively on this show and in the wider world. And so how do we make sure businesses are supporting the individuals who work for them as we get them assistance? And businesses are going to need redevelopment. The Small Business Administration, which is where most of this usually comes from, actually just provides 0 interest loans. They do not provide grants. So that's one piece of the puzzle there. For individuals and individual households, the FEMA declaration provides a huge amount of provides sort of 100% of assistance now without the state needing to kick in any dollars, but has like a pretty low cap in terms of the amount of dollars it'll pay for rebuilding. Most homes will cost more than that. We also don't, we had a contractor shortage before this,
Yes.
and that's likely not going anywhere.
Yeah, and probably there are contractors who now have to fix their own homes.
Yes. So there's that piece of the puzzle. And then there's towns and town roads and state roads. So there is usually a $75 match from FEMA for roads.
$75?
Sorry, 75%. Thank you.
Okay.
A 75% match from FEMA for those roads. So the state's going to need to find the money to kick in for those matches to rebuild both state roads and to make sure that towns have the matching funds for town roads. Towns also have a lot of other infrastructure challenges, such as, one community I saw, like, I think it was Johnson, their whole wastewater system was wiped out. That's very expensive to rebuild. It's also the kind of thing that we've been wanting to invest in rebuilding around the state for a long time, right? Like a lot of our wastewater infrastructure has been in serious trouble, certainly Montpelier's, for, decades. And so as we're rebuilding, are we making sure we find the resources to rebuild better, or are we just going to patch things together? We know that another storm is coming. And then there's also folks have property taxes likely due fairly soon on many properties that might have just been reappraised at much higher values than they even were appraised at a year ago, Montpelier, and they might not have homes anymore.
Yeah, that's painful.
So what mechanisms do we have in state government to figure out a way to reconcile that, even legally, because we're out of session right now, right? The Commissioner of Taxes the Commissioner of Taxes has the authority to essentially postpone due dates, and has done that for the majority of taxes for people who are impacted by flooding, in case anyone hasn't heard that yet. So sales tax, meals and rooms tax, corporate income tax, personal income tax, all of that has matched up with the federal postponement, and none of those are due until the fall if you were impacted by flooding, and you have to be impacted by flooding to be sort of taking that delay. But the property taxes are due to towns. Towns can postpone those payments. They do have the authority to do that by essentially just waiving fees. But in the end, towns owe the state that money. And if the towns are not paying the state that money is needed to pay for our schools, which also are having infrastructure damage and likely need some funding to rebuild. Montpelier High School being one of them. And so there's a question then of where are we going to find those resources as well. So it's really like quite a few different, and those are just what I've sort of come up with a few people off the top of my head. That is not sort of a comprehensive overview, especially looking at where spending was with Irene. It's also possible that our revenues in some areas are going to be going down. As say we're collecting less meals and rooms tax from somewhere like Montpelier. Also might be going up because we have all this federal money spent coming in, and we know how much federal spending can impact our state economy. So that's my sky.
Yeah, thank you for that outline, because it in my mind too, it's like you can kind of see the log jams that are sprinkled through the entire system that are going to impact other parts of the system. That nothing's happening here in a vacuum. We have just about 5 minutes before we need to hear from some underwriters. John, as someone who is,
follow-up for Emily on this, and that is, I'm wondering, and I know Irene was before your time in the State House, but I'm wondering if if Irene is an example of what we can expect in terms of a natural disaster's impact on state finances.
We're looking at that, and certainly our Joint Fiscal Office is doing a lot of exploration of comparing those numbers. There are some big differences though. So, we really asked tourists not to come here after Irene. because the damage in this time was much more localized, and I'm going to call Brattleboro the entrance to Vermont. Never done that before, but I'm going to do it right now.
The gateway.
What? The gateway.
The gateway.
The gateway. We are the gateway to Vermont. And, everything is, Brattleboro is struggling, but Brattleboro is struggling because of opioids and homelessness, not because of flood damage. And so we have, a full influx of tourists right now. They should just sort of, be careful if they're going to go on very certain dirt roads, a couple hours out of town. And so it's not clear if the flooding is going to impact tourist traffic, except for in these very specific towns and what that means. Also, pre-Irene, we did not have the Wayfair decision, and we did not have the same level of online shopping that we have now. So having stores be closed had a much bigger impact on our collection of sales tax than we have now. And we were less able to collect corporate profits from businesses that were located outside of Vermont but making sales into Vermont. And so those are a few places where I imagine that the revenue hit from Irene will not be anywhere near as heavy.
Thank you for that, Emily. John, anything quick before we take a break?
Well, I guess I would like to make sure that we talk, as we did a little bit earlier, about the situation with homelessness. We were about to embark on an ambitious effort to get the unhoused into at least some kind of housing situation, and also to build a lot more affordable housing and shelter capacity. And now we have unknown numbers of additional unhoused people, and fresh demands on state resources from the storm damages. So I'm wondering where we are at, if we have any idea, with this big housing effort that has just started to unroll.
I don't think that there are intentions to roll back the momentum forward or to pause the momentum. I do have some concerns about just sort of the limited capacity of state government to pay attention to multiple things at once. But it does seem that a lot of the flood recovery work is sort of, and the housing work are happening in slightly different places in state government. And so I'm going to retain some hope on that. I'm going to retain some hope that we are all capable of walking and chewing gum, and that Vermonters need us to be capable of that. There's also, the majority of homelessness, and especially the motel housing program, was in Burlington, Rutland, and Brattleboro. Barry certainly, has its fair share of folks who are struggling. But those three towns have seen very little impact. And so any momentum at the community level could keep on going forward. So, there certainly isn't any intentions to reallocate any funds at this point.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And some of the programs that we put in place during the veto session, like the expansion of funding for mobile homes, might actually be a good synergy with some flood recovery. But again, we don't really know, this is still early days. We really don't know how many folks are impacted. The early days of the Red Cross, they were actually turning away people without permanent addresses. That's changed now. My sense of appalled at that is really has no edges. But so we just don't really have a sense of how many people and how long they'll be out of their homes. And then Senator Kennedy, who's the Speaker's Chief of Staff and lives in Montpelier and has been doing a lot of work in flood recovery there, said this morning that, while people's apartments on upper floors in Montpelier are perfectly fine, in order to rehab the lower levels, building owners might ask people to leave temporarily. And who knows how long that temporary will be.
Well, thank you. We need to hear quickly from some underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. your community radio station. But stay tuned, we will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with journalist John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer, as well as regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps in Brattleboro. And if you're looking for the happy hour, you can find us every Friday at 2 on WVEW, as well as rebroadcast on Wednesday mornings at 8 a.m., also on the radio station. Thanks to BCTV, you can find us on many of the public access stations around Vermont, and of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. And if you're ever interested in talking to Emily and I, of course, you can send us an email at the montpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. Hey, Emily, what should we remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, not the station, nor their employees, friends, neighbors, pets.
Thank you. So, this is where I want to dive in first, folks, because at the happy hour, we do try to bring it back often, the topic to what are the stories we tell about ourselves, and how do those stories shape things like our identity and policy and our forward movement. And I'm curious, what stories are you hearing about Vermont right now, John Walters, in this flooding? And are they in the context of Irene? Are they in the context of, we always love our Vermont exceptionalism. Like, what stories are you hearing right now?
Well, I mean, the overwhelming narrative is Vermont strong, and it's neighbors helping neighbors and people pitching in and, helping other people, showing up on Main Street and helping merchants dig out their basements, giving to GoFundMes, giving to community funds set up for flood relief and recovery. And it is all true. And it is all great, and it's not enough to get us where we need to go. There needs to be an institutional government component to it as well. So we can tell ourselves heartwarming stories, and they are true enough. I will also pause here for a moment. I spent part of this week in Long Lake, New York, which is a little tiny town in the center of the Adirondacks. It is absolutely Trump country. These are the people who sent Elise Stefanik to Congress by huge margins. You see a lot of Trump banners and signs around. They did the same thing. They were hit hard by a dam breach. Some people lost their homes. There's a lot of road damage. Everybody went out and pitched in. It's not something that just happens in Vermont. It happens in a lot of places when disaster strikes. It does bring out the best in a lot of us. And it does, generate a lot of goodwill and a lot of action. And that's the only good thing about having a flood, I think, is it reminds us of our human capacity to care for each other.
One of my favorite, not favorite, I don't know why I need to modify my sentences today. One of my strongest memories from post-Irene was having a lot of friends down here in Brattleboro who were really upset that they hadn't canned more, like set more pickles aside, or didn't have sort of a more self-sufficient, sort of homesteading situation. And these were like people who were already sort of on the homesteading wagon. And my reaction to that same phenomenon in the same community was, I am so grateful for sort of like American industrial agriculture, and that like when our farmland is wiped out, we can still get vegetables from a truck across the country, and that we have canned food that can last a decade, not just 2 years, the way a lot of jarred canned food is, and that there are helicopters that can come in and save us. And like all of that only works with a fully functioning government. And so I love Vermont Strong. I love the incredible mutual aid networks that built up during the pandemic that are being reactivated. I appreciate that we turn out. I think it's been really beautiful what I've seen in downtowns like Montpelier and Barrie and Londonderry, with people like all pitching in the streets. But I do think that there's like a bootstraps, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps vibe to it all that really keeps us from remembering that something needs to come next, that we deserve for something to come next. And that is our obligation to hold our government responsible for doing something next. And that we shouldn't have to do it all ourselves, because there is like, that is what government is for, is to provide like, warming shelters and cooling shelters and making sure everyone has potable water. And like, and Vermont Strong, I think, is like very heartening, but it really keeps us from doing that. There was this picture on Twitter that John Quinn, former ADS secretary, posted of the governor like digging out a neighbor's driveway with his backhoe, and like, so glad that the governor was doing that for his neighbor. And I was like, why isn't the governor governing? Why is he on a backhoe? What is going on here?
Well, I think it's, sorry, John, I think it's a stronger story of, in Vermont, we are so attached to surviving that we forget about thriving. And I think quite often in these stories of like Vermont Strong, as you said, that bootstrap component of doing it all ourselves, we forget that we settle for just getting by and just good enough rather than sustainability. Sorry, John.
It actually ties into something I wrote on my blog, it was called "This is the Easy Part," and it was about standing firm and resolute at press conferences and talking about the steps that are being taken and everything good that's going on. And yes, responding forthrightly in a crisis is a governing skill, but it is not as difficult as maintaining and improving government over the long haul. And doing that long distance, that long-term response that Emily just spoke about, is the harder task that awaits us, or that we are transitioning to slowly. And so doing something like jumping on a backhoe helps a neighbor, but it doesn't solve the institutional problems. And that is the real test of leadership. It's not flashy. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't get you live TV, but it's what we really need in order to make Vermont a more resilient place and a thriving place for all its residents.
And it's a lot less, it's a lot sexier to announce like immediate funds available for small businesses that are struggling than it is to make an announcement about immediate funds available for town government as it does recovery planning, right? But the sort of ripple effects of one versus the other is quite significant, and we need to do both, right? And so what we sort of prioritize because it's the sexy Vermont Strong part of recovery versus what we prioritize because it's what will help us build back better. That was an accident, but I am pleased with it. Is an interesting part of this.
Yeah, I sat in on one municipal meeting, I believe it was Londonderry Select Board, and they were talking about data collection and how to collect the data about what roads have been hit, what culverts need to be fixed, that type of thing. And it struck me that, on the face of it, this is a really like monotonous, minutia kind of conversation. And yet, if you don't have that granular data, you don't even know what problem you're starting with.
Mhm.
And I've often said to folks, you know, because I have my fiction writer life and my journalist life, you know, if I'm writing a movie about state government, I'm going to make it, you know, an action hero blockbuster, right? Because that's fun. That is fun entertainment. But as a journalist, I like it when the select board meetings are boring. You know, I like it when all the FOIA requests are being answered in a timely manner. Like, it's boring as heck, but it means everything's operating well. And that's ultimately what you want in your state government.
You know, on that data and Vermont Strong, you know, I mentioned at the top of our conversation that folks should be calling 211 to report damages. Vermont Strong and that sort of call to arms, I think it's just the kind of thing that keeps us from thinking that our damages are worthy of making a call to the
Mm,
state government. And without sort of that ask for help, a governmental ask for help, we don't know the scale of the damages and we can't prioritize resources.
very,
When
yes. Would you
everything
say that
stays,
again, Emily? I think that
yeah,
was very good.
when everything, I'm not going to say it the same way because I'm not capable of that. When everything stays hyper local, when we all think we're just going to solve it between ourselves and our neighbors, we don't ask for help from government. There's no way we can account for the scale of the situation or the challenges that we're facing. And then we can't prioritize resources effectively, and we can't draw down federal money appropriately. So everyone in the state, even if you've had a little bit of damages from just taking on some water in your basement, please call 211 to report it.
And
Thank you.
I have to say that whenever I have seen a mention of 211 in the media, there seems to be someone rolling their eyes and saying it's impossible to get through.
Also
Mm,
true.
And I, you know, that's the kind of nuts and bolts management of state government that is even more necessary than standing up and being strong in a press conference.
yes.
And it I mean, it's early days and all of that, but it reminds me of the first couple of months of the COVID epidemic when our unemployment insurance system just completely imploded.
Hmm.
And it makes me wonder, from the liberal political commentator's viewpoint, how competent our current state government is.
And we have been reducing funding to 211 for quite a while now. It was a really robust program and we'd invested a lot of resources in making it more and more robust about 8 years ago. And then we've slowly
Oh, interesting.
like started limiting hours, limiting things that flow through it. It's been, yeah.
Mhm. Well, let's just name this right now, because I believe, John, you had mentioned during the break that while it's early days, you have been hearing just murmurs on the ground questioning the effectiveness of the administration. And so let's just sort of name that and say, okay, so what are we expecting? Like, when we say effectiveness, how are we defining that? What does that look like?
Well, and you know, the caveat is it is early days. We're less than 2 weeks away from the immediate deluge that caused all of this. We're still under the potential for more flooding. So in a way, it's unfair to expect state government to have all the answers and have everything in place. Uh,
Mhm.
that said, you know, you see signs here and there. You had, you know, the state officials insisting at a press conference a few days ago that there was no town, there was no town in Vermont without water, and that turned out not to be true. And
Mhm.
the Public Service Commissioner got in some hot water for suggesting that a town official had botched informing state officials when in fact he had informed state officials and they had dropped the ball.
Mm.
Um, you know, you had Mark Mahali, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, state rep from Calais, north of Montpelier, uh, whose communities, his 3 towns in his district, And they have not seen any help yet from the transportation agency or anyone else on getting their roads straightened out. And, his comment was, the contrast between what the governor and cabinet members say and what is happening on the ground is striking. So again, there are questions, and State Senator Becca White yesterday on the subject of water tweeted out, there are towns without water in Windsor County. And if there are more towns out there that are not getting the help they need, are not getting, the merchants in Montpelier are still waiting for trash disposal. There are still mountains of trash along Main Street and State Street, and the side streets where people live.
Mhm.
So it's unfair to render any sort of final judgment, but there are questions beginning to be asked about how effective the administration is. And I think it is incumbent on our media and on perhaps the legislature to take a serious look at this once we're out of the immediate emergency.
Mhm. Thank you, John. Emily, how about you? What are some hallmarks of when someone says effective government to you? What are some of those hallmarks? What are some of those?
This is Emily's jam.
Oh, it totally is.
I need an
She's
hour for
smiling.
this question, Olga. My God, what are you doing to me?
Not even noon.
At the very most basic, I want someone to answer the phone
Mhm.
in less than a minute. And I want the person on the other end of the phone to either know the answer to my question or to know how to get the answer to my question. And I want that person to be responsible for calling me back.
Mhm.
And that is, I think the worst example of that is, my federal college loan servicing experiences. But I think, at the state level, I think our unemployment insurance system is still rocky with that regard. And, I've heard a lot about when no one answers the phone when we call 211. So that's like, for me, the most like just someone answers the phone when you call.
Yeah.
I think being able to think broadly and prioritize around ripple effects and planning for the future. State government needs to think more than 3 months out, more than 2 months, more than 2 years out. It needs to be really thinking generationally. I think that's effective government.
Mhm.
So again, building back better, building back more resiliently, not doing what's sexy, but what's effective,
Mhm.
and deeply data-informed decision-making. And that data is qualitative and quantitative data and includes the perspectives of those who are most marginalized, and has, both geographic diversity, class diversity, racial diversity, identity diversity, all of those things. And so, when we only talk to the folks who are dealing with the recovery in Montpelier, and we leave out the folks who are dealing with recovery in the Kingdom or in Windsor County or in the islands, we're missing a very important part of the story.
Exactly. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, your first comment about having someone answer the phone really struck a chord with me, because it's my opinion that for our government, there's a lot of things necessary for governments to work and be effective. But it's also really important for them to be effective in a way that their communities believe in and trust and support. And having someone answer the phone when you call, when you've been told that this is the number you should be calling by government, I think is such one of those little things that is actually a piece of bedrock
Yes.
for an effective democracy. Um,
So I just have an example of a place that government does work.
yes.
It's going to seem like something that doesn't work. So Route 30 down here in Brattleboro has been being repaved for a bajillion years now, and everyone's really frustrated about it. And part of the reason it's taking so long is because they're actually like scraping below where they usually scrape, so that the like structural things that cause potholes. I don't have very good road words, but
Mhm.
will be fixed. And so it's not just like a surface, I don't know, whatever the words are for that.
It's not just an overlay or a patching. They're actually redoing the road.
Yes, thank you,
Yep.
Olga. And so part of that involves a lot of very spiky gravel. And
A lot of
everyone
driving like this.
yeah. And so there's like the traffic part that's really annoying, that's like understandable but annoying, and the fumes, that's sort of understandable but annoying. But a huge number of people are getting flat tires from the spiky gravel. In fact, everyone I know, including my own family, has gotten a flat tire from the spiky gravel. The gravel is spiky because we actually don't have the way we make gravel now is actually causes spikier gravel than the way we used to make gravel because of some sort of like the type of rocks we make gravel out of now. I'm not going to get onto that. So that's like one place, like essentially like our resource scarcity and the way we use resources has led us to this spiky gravel problem. But more importantly, when we write to the Agency of Transportation about it and the company doing the paving, they're actually incredibly responsive, provide comprehensive updates, will talk to anyone about anything that's going on, and people can file for damages and receive them. And so like government has created an incredibly annoying problem while trying to solve a solution. Some of that is like generational problems, like this ridiculous spiky gravel thing. Some of it, but they answer the phone when you call. And it makes the world of difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emily. One thing that came up again, talking to another reporter, and I'm going to be very broad on the details because I don't know all of them, but I guess some of the flooding in Windham County in one community was caused by a dam that had given way. And we're not talking the big dams, we're not talking Ball Mountain, we're not talking the hydroelectric dams. It was a smaller dam that someone had, I think, had on their property, or maybe it had been there for a long time and the community liked it. I don't know, but it was a pretty dam. It wasn't necessarily a functional dam. And this reporter and I were talking about, once again, that tension in Vermont about protecting the postcard. Like, we like the pretty pictures, but what's this piece of infrastructure or this pretty hillside or whatever actually doing? Like, how are we serving it and how is it serving us? And I'm wondering if either of you have kind of come across some of that in your travels with the flood recently.
Yeah, a really good example of that is bridges where things get stuck versus bridges where things don't get stuck. So if stuff
Yes.
gets stuck in a riverbed because of the way the bridge is structured, that causes immense amount of flooding. And if a bridge is constructed so that the objects can flow under and through, we have a much less light, right? It's like allowing the river to flow is how you avoid flood damage.
Mhm.
To flow where it wants to. And so the more you like get it stuck by infrastructure or get it stuck with debris, the more flooding damage you'll have. And a lot of our beautiful old bridges, stuff gets stuck.
Mm-hmm. How about you, John?
Well, I'm going to mention something that's tangential here, and that is Vermont Public, formerly known as VPR, has a podcast called Brave Little State, and
Mhm.
their current episode was planned before the flood, but it's awfully timely. It's about our rivers and streams, and it's about how throughout the eons, our rivers and streams were sort of slow flowing and meandering and had a lot of floodplain. And in the course of civilizing our land, we made our rivers and streams flow much straighter and much faster and took away a lot of the floodplain.
Yeah.
And the result is that flooding is quicker and much more devastating than it would have been before there was human habitation. And of course, nobody's homes would have been flooded out by then. But anyway, that's sort of unintended consequences. That kind of thing is something we're going to need to look at and reassess how we handle our rivers and streams.
Mhm.
from now on, because, we are in the era of climate change, and
Yes.
things are only going to become less predictable and more extreme. And this is, I hate to say it, just the beginning.
Mhm. I was thinking about flooding in general, of course, during the highest water on that Monday in earlier July. I can't remember the date now. I was in downtown Wilmington watching the water overflow some of the banks, especially behind Crafts Inn and um,
Olga, why are
along
you
the
watching it rather than going home to BC?
because I was a reporter and I was
I just
reporting on
I'm
it.
gonna go another public service announcement, like the rubbernecking that I have seen since this started, whether that is in a disaster zone or recreating, is not good for anyone. Don't do it. Okay, back to you. Also, don't swim in a river for like a month. We can't, the
Yes.
rivers are not safe. They are full of pollution and debris and unexpected currents. Even if it's like a little puddle that you've always swam at with your toddler, don't do it. Okay, back to you, Olga.
Yes, the rivers are not the rivers we know right now. But I was sitting there and I was talking to I did have a purpose, and I parked my car away from like so I could get out if I needed to. Anyway, I was talking to the emergency management folks and the town manager, but I was looking at downtown Wilmington and I was thinking about that discussion of with climate change, do we just need to take some of these downtowns and move them away from the river? Even if they've been there hundreds of years, pull them out and move them. And I was thinking about that, and I was looking at Wilmington as an example where right in the downtown, near the Route 9 bridge, there are buildings whose foundations, like their basements, are the river edge.
Mhm.
Like this is the riverbank, is this building. And it just brought home for me how knitted we are to our rivers, in some cases quite literally, and yet our involvement has actually caused part of the problem.
Mhm.
And I don't have an answer for that. It's just what I'm sitting with right now of, how we are part of these environments and how are we interacting with them and how are they interacting with us.
So I've thought about that too. I think it's unrealistic to think that we're going to move downtowns, especially something like Montpelier's downtown, right? Where we have really multiple story buildings. But we don't have all that many downtowns. And so what we can do is to do these floodplains just right above downtowns
Mhm.
in multiple places. And it really does, it makes all of the difference.
Thank you. We are out of time. John, quickly, anything you want to add before we end for the day?
Well, I would just say, in spite of my mixed feelings about Vermont Strong, every little bit does help. If you know someone who needs help, help them. If you find a GoFundMe page for a family that's lost everything, give what you can. There are plenty of funds out there for flood relief, for rebuilding. You know, pay your taxes with the idea that you're doing something for your community, that money is going to good purposes. Um, do what you can. And, we want to hold government accountable for what it needs to do, but every little bit does help.
Thank you, John. And John, if people want to read your work on the Vermont Political Observer, what's the website?
It is very simple, thevpo.org. That's short for Vermont Political Observer. If if you Google the VPO, you'll probably find me and the Vienna Philharmonic.
Always in good company. Emily, how about you if folks want to reach out to you?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to all the ways to get in touch with me, as well as signing up for my newsletter.
Thank you. And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, or subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and have a good weekend.